So today we'll be discussing whether blockchain technology will be a game changer for supply chains, and if so, how can it be applied to global trade management in general. So now on to some words about our speakers today. So first up will be Jakub. Jakub is our solutions consultant at Amber Road. He has extensive experience in the supply chain industry, specifically working with technology providers. He enjoys taking on challenges by working with a variety of companies to help develop innovative solutions. And he has worked on projects such as DHL's Customer Visibility Platform, Exxon's Ocean Booking and Visibility Platform, as well as Syngenta's Global Atlantis project. Jakub is also our in-house consultant at Amber Road for everything that is Internet of Things and blockchain. And afterwards, we have Daniel from Maersk, who will be presenting as well. So Daniel Wilson is our special guest today. He's joining us, and he is Maersk's Director of Business Development for a new initiative that they have launched. In January, Maersk announced that they have the intention to form a joint venture with IBM to develop a digital utility for the supply chain industry. The platform would use in part blockchain technology. Daniel is originally from New Zealand and joined Maersk Line at the end of 2014. Since, he has held several commercial roles in the Asia Pacific region, including managing the relationship with some of Maersk's largest customers. A year ago, he relocated to Copenhagen to join the global trade digitization team. So on the agenda today, Jakub will get us started, and he will be up first to provide an overview of blockchain and its value within the global trade industry. Afterwards, Daniel will deep dive into the project he's working on with Maersk. So before we begin, we'd like to ask you all a question. So within your organization, what does blockchain technology mean? Now you'll have a couple of options up on your screen. So please select whatever applies to you most. So either is it overhyped and there isn't any value in it. It might be something that's interesting to you. You're looking to use it if technology becomes outdated, or you are applying it and investing in it because you see the value in it for the future. Okay, so here are the results. It looks like the most popular by a landslide actually is that you're looking into the relevance of blockchain technology for your organization. That came in at 58%. And next we have people that are investing in it because it is the technology of tomorrow. That came in at 25%. All right, well, thank you for participating. And now I will pass it on to Jakub. Please welcome Jakub.
Thank you, Talia, for the introduction, as well as thank you for running the poll. And thanks everyone for joining this webinar, which we do for the broader audience on the topic of a blockchain. I'm personally very happy to do this topic and talk to you today, as well as I'm very humbled to be part of this kind of a new approach or new movement in this whole technology world. The results which Talia has been reading, that's very interesting to know. So we know that a lot of you who are on the call now do know that there is a potential value and are really looking for use cases and valuable inputs. So what we believe is that this webinar will help you to a little bit navigate around, again, what a little bit blockchain is, as well as what are the possible use cases for your organization or for your environment or ecosystem, so to say. So let me just begin directly with what we have on the agenda. So first thing is, we believe that yes, blockchain will revolutionize the global trade. It will be the technology of tomorrow. Well, the question is, when is this tomorrow? And it will really bring a lot of new use cases and new value drivers into the whole industry. Many of you may have been exposed to a lot of these terms like wallet, like ICO, like a smart contract, and it's a little bit overhyped and it's all over the place, and that's okay, we believe. What we also believe is that the blockchain is a little bit still not fully understand. That means people do already get the point of the value, get the point about that it's about immutability or about unique ownership of a record, right? But still, there is still not full exploration done in its path. I used to always compare it to a very simple situation where someone buys a BMW, but yet doesn't realize the full potential and drive this BMW only on the gear 1 or gear 2. But in the future, we will see that there are more gears, and these new gears will redefine our the way we work. All right, let me a little bit attempt, and I know that maybe many of you may hear this already for multiple times. Maybe let me attempt to do a little bit of again explanation what blockchain is as such, right? And I am from the technical background, but I'm not trying to explain here how mining works, how hashing works. These are all very cool things, but they are quite technical. And a lot of people on our level, when we talk to them or from the customer side, do struggle to, well, they may not struggle to understand the technicality, but they may struggle to grab the applicability of that technology. So how we look at the blockchain is it's a new paradigm, so to say. Now, what this means, the internet, we know that the internet of sharing, of collaboration, of having our social networks or having social networks in business. This is the internet of information. Since the 90s, we are basically sharing emails, sharing documents like purchase orders or shipment, sharing pictures, right? And it's all fine. And that has really changed the way we live, and it has changed the way we work. And we can't imagine really the life without it anymore, like 15 years ago or 20 years ago. We did live without internet, so to say, right? Now, Internet of Information has the feature that it's an information about the real things, right? And I give examples, for example, a picture which I took with my friend over the weekend. I have the first instance on my phone, for example, or camera, and I share it with my friend, and he has a copy. This my friend do have the same copy and share it with another friend, and perhaps with a third friend altogether. So there are altogether 4 entries of that information on the internet or on the network. Now, this is basically what the Internet of Value, aka blockchain, will kind of avoid. Now, what is Internet of Value? So things which have some sort of a value now in a monetary ways or in an ownership perspective. So money, stocks, identities, or rights to certain or entitlements to certain real property, right? So these things cannot be handled, cannot be copied, right? Cannot be. We have to make sure that there are basically certain one owner of that thing or one person who is in possession of that particular money entry, right? And until in the first era, as I have it on the screen, it has been always the intermediaries who arrange and who handles this thing, like banks, governments, brokers, or whatsoever. These intermediaries do basically make sure or to kind of assure that the entities in a trade or in the transactions are those that they claim to be. So I give a quick example. I'm sending €100 to my friend in India. I have a bank here in Europe, as well as the friend in India has a bank in India. And these are the entities who need to verify who we are, have to verify that I have the money that I'm claiming to have the money, and so on. I have today internet banking that I can, execute that through, but there are still the entities on the way of that transfer. So now what blockchain did, or what kind of blockchain is offering, is solving what is called a double spending problem. So if I am doing the transactions purely on the blockchain without the intermediaries, I can't cheat. I can't basically send the same coin to my friend in India as well as to my friend in China, so to say, right? Now, this is basically inherent valuable or inherent nature or characteristic of a blockchain. And I like that word, and I have, this is not from my head, I have read it from one of the key speaker on the blockchain topic. I like that word, trust protocol. Now, if we scrap the surface a little bit more deeper, so what it means is basically we can now store, transfer, transact any kind of valuable things without intermediaries, or I would almost say nearly without, or the role of the intermediaries will need to be redefined, right? What happened some 10 years ago when Satoshi Nakamoto, who is the creator of the original Bitcoin concept, he has published it in his white paper. What he basically did is not only that he make alive the Bitcoin network and coin as such, but what I think is the greatest contribution to our society is solving this, what we call the double spend problem, meaning we can now transact peer-to-peer, being it a peer-to-peer as a people or peer-to-peer as a company to company without or nearly without any intermediaries. So the other word I like that the Economist magazine some time ago, when doing the deep dive onto the blockchain, described this as a trust machine. So if you think about it, it's not only it's a new technology, it's now suddenly in the way we transact, we will now introduce some sort of a machine or some sort of a system or a software that will be part of the transactions and will help or verify that whole process, right? So this is, I think, first time in a kind of a human history that we do still trade, say, person to person or company to company, but we will have a kind of machine in between or facilitating the transaction, which will do some part of the decision on our behalf. So this is really something revolutionary. And still it allows the trust and maintains the trust of the process. Now, again, as I said before, I am a little bit technical person, but I'm not trying to explain the technicalities of a blockchain. I believe if you go on the online, you look on YouTube, there's tons of videos and tons of educational materials to explain it. I like to explain it on an example. So I picked the example of a land registry transaction. So what happens today is, and I just went through that about a half year ago, I was selling my apartment. So today what the business works is that me as a seller, I found a buyer who's willing to pay, but because we don't trust each other, we don't know each other so much, right? Or we can be even in different jurisdictions or different locations, we hired a lawyer, either a lawyer or real estate agency, who basically introduced us to the third party account or contract where we lock our assets. So the buyer locks his money into it, I lock my signature or my documents about the house that I'm willing to sell, right? And then, of course, in the contract stipulated what has to happen when. And then if we get now the land registry as one of the public entity in this occasion, it may, of course, take time. Now, in my case, it was weeks, almost months, to do the change of the title of the apartment, of the house. So basically, we needed to wait, and in that meanwhile, it was the lawyer who was in charge of the transaction. If everything went well, we basically swapped the assets and we were happy. Now, what it means, we did, of course, pay a certain fee to the lawyer or to the middleman entity, so to say, and it was, of course, quite slow. Now, let me draw a future a little bit here. And again, I'm not anyhow kind of trying to address here a real estate industry. It's just something I'm trying to pick to demonstrate the future possibilities of it. Again, I'm more into the supply chain rather than the real estate world. So in the future, how it may work. So again, we have a buyer-seller. The buyer-seller would need to, now this is a good question, how do we call it? But let's call it, we need to hire or we need to employ a smart contract. Eventually, behind the smart contract, there may be a lawyer's company which runs that eventually. So we are not fully after intermediaries here, but we redefine the way they work. So it's an opportunity as well. Now, same process, buyer locks his money, seller locks his entitlement and the signature basically that he's willing to sell this property at a given price at a given time. Now, important thing, as you see on the screen a little bit lower, it is a little bit dependent on the what I call here blockchain-enabled land registry. So basically a certain public authority which will provide information about the change of title in some sort of electronic form or even blockchain-enabled form. Eventually here is, the transaction still happens. We still sell, I still sell my house, right? But the value here is a full automation, lower fees, and much higher efficiencies in this process. Now, when I take that into much more higher level, right, I can, the way I'm looking at it is there are two levels of, or there are two types of blockchains, so to say. And again, this is a little bit my terminology. So we have the blockchains of currencies, like either the cryptocurrencies or it could be a standard currencies, but just in an electronic form, right? So this is one part of the equation. The other part is what I call a IoT blockchain. So basically blockchain of a real assets. Now be it the house with the land registry, or it could be a blockchain of tracking, for example, my goods which travel from Asia to Europe, right? Where does this move? Where is it originating from, and so on. Now the smart contract will not only do the transaction, but the smart contracts of the future should be able to talk blockchains to blockchains. So they will basically be able to have some sort of interfaces between them to facilitate that particular transaction, right? So I hope this helps to understand this whole thing with the blockchain. Again, I'm trying to rather show a generic use case and generic value, and not to go into the details of how exactly this works. And in a way, we don't really need to know how exactly is the technology working, unless of course we want to, right? Take the example from 90s, the internet. The internet runs on the TCP/IP protocol, but how many of us do know details of the TCP/IP protocol? I mean, to some degree we do know how does it work, but we don't need to know the details. We need to understand how the internet works and what kind of business or personal value it can bring to us. So it's the same way is with the blockchain, all right? So let me now talk quickly about some of the proposed use cases in supply chain. And then we also talk about some of the mainstream technologies. So before I actually start with the use cases, let me kind of have these two statements out of my mouth. So it's one interesting thing, as Mr. Brody from Ernst & Young has mentioned here, there has been a really large shift in the last 1 year to 18 months where companies are already understanding what it is, like what we also see in the pool, and are more investigating how that may work. Prove it to me. Show me that it can work. Show me that it can basically bring some sort of value. There's tons of working conference pilots, proof of concept being in the industry, and this is why I'm glad that we have a Daniel today on with us. There's also quite a few applications which are real production applications, which brings value today. The other statement of Mr. Farnley from Worldwide Blockchain Strategies is that supply chain is really one of the best examples or best suited for blockchain, because in the supply chain there is many disparate parties in the disparate locations in disparate jurisdictions which do the transactions together, right? And for this by nature is just a good candidate for application of a distributed electronic ledger, aka blockchain. But again, we need to have a warning that not every blockchain, not every use case is good for blockchain. We always have to question ourselves when we kind of run into this. Is there some value, some really a tangible value when we compare it to a classical central database? So this is always a case which I would be posing to any of the company trying to do blockchain activity. Let's talk about tokens. So we have been understanding the blockchain primarily from the financial perspective, because we have now actually quite a lot of cryptocurrencies on the market, and that's all fine, or that's all quite interesting. But in supply chain, we may not necessarily always use a financial asset, right? So if it's not a valuable asset, financial asset, we can interpret the transfer as a token. And as the picture on the top corner shows the two runners, basically it's the same thing. Basically, we represent a transaction and we represent unique ownership or possession, let's be more precise, of a token in a given transaction, right? Now, tokens can be pretty much anything, the way we design it. So it could be hours of energy, right? Of a solar energy being produced and being sold, right? It could be the currency, as we know already. It could be a promise of a product for the future. So this is the ICOs, for example. It could be a download of a song, right? So this is very good for artists, for example, where they will basically be in control how their song is being used, right? It could be any insurance policy. It could be even a ticket. So there's tons of applications of the token, so to say, and many of the experts in the industry talk about so-called tokenization of economy. So turning transactions, turning the way we interact with each other into tokens. And once we turn them into tokens, then we can model them in a digital blockchain world. So here's, and I'm not going to go through all of them because there's tons of these examples, but here are some of them being listed. One other thing I want to mention here, the way it works, and I'm picking up here on one of the industry platform where a lot of the current blockchains are being developed. That's the Ethereum platform. So the Ethereum platform works with the token in such a way that it has 3 layers. The very low layer is the TCP/IP. That's the communication internet layer, basically sending packets back and forth. The middle layer is the logic, is the programming language, and is the crypto token, so to say, being issued by the Ethereum itself. And the upper layer, the application layer, is where the logic is stored. So this is where the so-called smart contracts are being developed and being deployed, right? And these smart contracts may handle the financial tokens, so the cryptocurrency, but may also handle what is called a utility token. So basically a token of handling the transfer between one party to another. Let me bring you down into one more layer. So for global trade, so what can be tokens here? And I'm a little bit picking only on some of those. So for example, origin. Origin can be a token of an entity who produce a goods, meaning the producer or perhaps the supplier is the only entity who has rights to declare the goods comes from their factory and can have the only rights to issue the information about the goods. This is the key value here. Another excellent use case or excellent token is, or token example is export license, where a country could issue an export license document on a blockchain. So a particle give a token to a particular exporter, which basically enlists the information of what is being exported, what is the license of the goods to be exported, right? So I take extreme case guns. Sorry to take that one, but it's just very easy to demonstrate. And it can also monitor how much that exporter has been using the license. So if the export quota is 1,000 units per year, then basically the issuing government body can know what has been exported till date. Similar to the documents, I will not talk about it. The last one I want to talk about quickly is the goods. So the physical goods. So all of those above are pretty much entities or kind of assets which are already somewhat digitalized. The goods is the car, is the 5 boxes of t-shirts, it's the iPhone, for example, right? So this is a little bit harder to bring it to the blockchain, but the way is, or the kind of answer to that is Internet of Things. So either using unique numbers which are being embedded into the device, like a phone, like a smartphone, or using RFID tag or other IoT methods, so to say. But again, I'm not going to go too much into details because this will be worth of a separate webinar altogether. Let me talk about altogether 5 use cases, which I think brings the most of the value into global trade. First one is the one related to the finance part. Second one is global trade documents. That's something also Daniel will show us a little bit later. Third one is for provenance. Provenance is basically where does the information of the goods come from, right? So this is important. So it's not only the goods, but the information of the goods or information about the cargo comes from. Then I have shortly about vendor management inventory and shortly also about compliance. Supply chain finance. So typical process: buyer issues a purchase order, seller produce the goods, ship it out, produce the invoice. Everything seems to be quite fine. Now, buyer can condition the payment to the seller by putting it into a smart contract. And the few conditions, just as a very generic example, could be, for example, the one condition is that the cargo has been successfully shipped out in an actual quantity, right? And that aligns with the invoice quantity. Second condition could be that the invoice is approved, corrected, and already cleared with discounts and deductions, right? Now, then only the money can be wired out of the smart contract, right? Now, if the seller wants to, so at this stage, it's basically payment is being approved but not yet wired because there is 30 days payment terms, right? So a seller can easily bring into the blockchain a bank or some sort of a factoring entity that basically loan the money on a better terms. Now, the value here in this use case is basically a full transparency, not only on the physical flows, but also on the financial flows, but also assurance of pay for the seller. So the seller knows he's getting money, it's safe, and he can even go and get the money, so to say, sooner with a better rate than if he would go in his local market and obtain the loan in his local bank, right? So that's very quite nice one, and it's related to the finances still. Second use case, trade documents. So each, and I will kind of do that a little bit quickly here, each document in the supply chain which is being issued could be put onto the blockchain. Now, why we would do that, right? Why we have to put everything on the blockchain? So first thing is the full digitalization. So basically in the blockchain, I have it fully digitalized. And not only that, I know who is the party who's entitled to issue that, and that only party will issue that. Nobody else could be tampering with that particular record. The other thing is all these documents can then, so what I would call, talk to each other, right? So there could be alignment of the data between the letter of credit and invoice, for example, on the quantity. Was there any kind of discrepancies? Was there anything which was introduced later on in the process? And that could be automatically reflected in this process as well, right? Third one, and that's the one which is mostly used today in many applications and many solutions by many entities, is what we call a provenance. So basically the story or the history where things come from, right? I put here two examples: quality inspections and facility compliance. So basically at the origin, the inspectors comes to the seller side and they do have their records of examinations. Now, if this is blockchain enabled, we know that even these third party did not cheat or didn't do any kind of fraudulent activity or record. They didn't copy the previous visit. They basically have done what they should have done, right? A good example of this also is, for example, in a pharma-owned chemical, right? Origin of the ingredients is tracking of batch numbers, tracking of serial numbers of ingredients, is knowing if a pharma or even chemical company need to do a recall, do know where all is distributed my batch, my product, that particular batch that was produced, which is wrong, right? Was I able actually to identify it? And was I then able to prove to the authorities that if it was somehow faulty production that I have destroyed, or I perhaps, did some particular process? This is a very big problem in the pharma and also in the other industries, to basically provide the information where things are or where they were in the past, right? I have also showed the VMI use case that's a little bit similar to the supply chain finance, and I've seen some application working already today, very, very excellent application. VMI is basically inventory being stored at the customer side. So typically what the seller is facing issue of not knowing what has been consumed, and secondly, what has have a problem of not being yet paid, or basically being short on cash flow. So again, this could solve this particular use case as well. My last one, and I kind of am very excited about this one, because I believe once the governments will onboard into this blockchain revolution, will understand that then we will see brand new or another level of the whole adoption. So this example is from Singapore. Singapore just recently launched a platform to issue and maintain the so-called certificate of origins for for Singaporean exporters. And this is basically quite a game-changing application, or game-changing process. In the past, with those that you know, the certificate of origin was basically issued just by the exporter. It was a piece of paper that was printed, being stamped perhaps, but it was kind of clumsy or maybe time-consuming to verify its information with any authorities, right? And usually the importers rely on that the exporters provide this document right. Now there is a public entity, actually the original intermediary who now redefine its role, who will issue that directly on the blockchain. And that represents not only automation, not only that it's swiftly there and it can be provided upon request really, but it also brings a huge transparency into the process of export from that particular country. Another good example is in Korea, customs offices are basically introducing the process on the blockchain as well. And what they are after really is to prevent the smuggling and fraud, as well as to increase the communication flow and the transparency of the whole process for both sides, for themselves as well as for the importers as such. I had a couple of examples which are only in my head now. For example, Switzerland allows now a company registration on the blockchain, or Netherlands is doing the land registry on the blockchain. So the one example which I had before. So once we will see that more and more governments will pick on that and will do their governmental roles on the blockchain, or at least at some sort of digital enabled processes, we will see a huge a rise of these applications and of blockchain as well. Now, let me only talk last couple of slides about the major two types of blockchain. So what happens is, and I believe to some of you this may be already known, but let me reiterate that. So we have two types of blockchain. We have the public one, so that's the Bitcoin, for example, which is decentralized. So that means there is no central authority governing that, and there's tons of nodes or so-called miners who are running that whole network. And it's basically, nobody can basically control it, which gives positives as well as negatives. One of the negative is what is called here the pseudonymous characteristics. So everyone can see how much a particular address, how many coins it has. So that's, I think, something which is a little bit harder to be accepted by the business nodes. So then there is answer for that in the form of a private blockchains. Private blockchains we kind of split into, we have another split into there as well. So we talk about consortium blockchain. So that's this so-called R3 consortium, which is primarily for banking, and this is really invitation only based. And the banking industry, or the set of banks which are running it, are aiming to use the blockchain to basically make their operation more smoother and more efficient, right? And then we have what we call a permission-based blockchain, which, for example, is the example of Maersk and IBM, based on the Hyperledger platform, which basically allows the same values as the public one, plus is allowing the permissioned blockchains. I will get to the point what is permissioned in a minute. Now, in general, once you will be considering any of these designs, it's always a question, right? So the second question you will always ask, to what degree we want to distribute the application? To what degree is this a kind of a community versus only my company application? So the amount of distribution, the higher distribution is there, the better decentralization, or better, there's no intermediary which would be controlling it, versus whether I want to fully control it and offer it into the market, right? Interesting thing is, and this is maybe as of today, there is 5, and again, this may not be ultimate list, but there's 5 major blockchain platforms, meaning these are the environment where the applications are being developed by either startups or companies or even individuals. So let's kind of quickly go through that. So the very known is Ethereum. Ethereum is very similar to Bitcoin in a way. The major difference is that Ethereum allows quite complex smart contract functionality. So basically giving some, basically, if you remember this example from the real estate industry, basically coding TED conditioned smart programs using a language called Solidity. The other characteristics of Ethereum is that it's so-called permissionless, meaning, again, as Bitcoin, everyone can see not everything, but a lot of things which may not be ideal for some industries. Next to that, we have a Hyperledger Fabric. That's basically developed by Linux Foundation, and one of the users is also IBM and Maersk now, for example, in their own joint venture. But there's also other applications running on the Hyperledger Fabric. The great difference here is basically this is permissioned blockchain, meaning only parties which are kind of entitled to see transactions will see the transaction. So that's important to say. But on the other hand, there is no cryptocurrency being issued here. It doesn't mean that if there's no cryptocurrency, there is still the token feature. So still the design of transfer of ownership from one end to another would work there. The other two are FreeCorda and Ripple. Is basically a little bit finance driven. So that's I will a little bit skip it now. The last one is Quorum. So the Quorum is based on Ethereum, and it is basically taking all the good things of Ethereum plus adding the permissioned features. So basically only allowing certain parties to see the transaction. Last part for me, I want to kind of familiarize you with some of the key terms which are being used in the current blockchain community whenever it comes to designing its own application. So one thing is so-called asset token and utility token. I have already used these two terms. So just quickly, the asset token is basically the financial representation, right, where a token can be sold for a certain price, versus utility token is being used for transfer of ownership or representation of a transaction as such. The other very hyped word is ICO, and I think also finally it is being kind of mimicking the IPO, the initial public offering, which is basically a company going on a stock exchange. So ICO is basically a fundraising mechanism solely using the asset tokens. There have been also some frauds in the past, in the last maybe 2 years. So a lot of regulations have been introduced in some jurisdiction, like for example in Switzerland. If a company or if entity want to go ICO, they have to provide or they have to introduce what is called a minimum viable product. Basically, this is a documentation or proof of work or proof of functionality, so to say, where it's not only about printing coins, right, that they would do, for example, on the Ethereum, but it's also showing what value that coin would bring into particular industry or to a particular ecosystem. And the last one, I think I need to explain that as proof of concept. So many companies do embark on the proof of concept and are asking, how can we benefit from that and what can we do with this? So this will be from me. I have hopefully brought you a lot of information on a generic level. And I believe Daniel from Maersk has some more about the practical application. Daniel, back to you.
Thank you, Jakob. Those were very interesting use cases. And as Jakob mentioned, Daniel will now be presenting a blockchain application he is working on. So please welcome Daniel.
Hi, everyone. My name's Daniel. I work for Maersk Line, and I work on a project which some of you may have heard of, which is currently called Global Trade Digitization. And essentially what it is we want to develop some tools which could act as a utility for the industry for the neutral sharing of data and documentation relating to the supply chain industry in a real and in an immutable, real time and immutable form. We really want to make sure that we're building something here that the entire industry can take and trust and use to improve their supply chain efficiencies. And essentially what I'm going to take you through in the time that I have today is what we're doing and what it might mean for you and your businesses. Bit of background, bit of a story. So my first job at Maersk was I worked in customer services, and you would get a call from a port saying, hey, Maersk Line said this container was going to be loaded on the ship, but it's not here. Is this actually going to be loaded? And so in customer service, your job is to answer that question. So you'll call up the BCO, and the BCO will say, we don't actually know exactly where it is at this stage. So you'd call the freight forwarder, and they would say, well, this has been subcontracted to the trucking company, so please call the trucking company. So you'd call the trucking company, and they would say, well, we have an idea of where it is, but we're going to have to radio the truck. And this back and forth can take as much as an hour to try and get this resolved. And Maersk Line frontline staff have thousands of these calls every week. And the reason for that is what you can see on the right-hand side there. There are dozens of parties who are involved with a shipment. These are ports and carriers, inland providers, banks, government authorities, freight forwarders, and the actual importers and exporters themselves. But none of them are able to talk to each other in a fully automated and streamlined manner. So what you have essentially is a series of data silos that exist around the supply chain industry, which to the extent that they are integrated, it's using 60-year-old technology with EDI communication, which is not real time and is prone to breaking. And if any of you on the call today or on this webinar have ever been interested in seeing what it would be like to code for an EDI, the capabilities to do that are becoming rarer and rarer because the programming language that is used is very much of a different generation. On the next slide, what you'll see is what we envision for the supply chain industry, which is instead of a series of point-to-point integrations or emails and phone calls, rather we want to build a set of tools which can act as an information backbone of the supply chain industry. So rather than Maersk Line calling a freight forwarder, calling a BCO, calling a trucking company, all of those parties can put in one place all of the information about their shipment, all of the documents about their shipment, and have that shared with the appropriate permissioned parties in real time. This can be done in a digital fashion, and it can be done to massively reduce some of the inefficiencies that we have with the existing supply chain industry. So how are we doing this? So we think it's important that once you've got all these parties of the supply chain industry connected and their documents and their data being shared in one place, the anticipation is that we then create a series of tools which can lever and use the data and documentation that exist within that platform. We envision in the future a suite of, or an ecosystem of applications that get built to lever those documents and those data. We want the entire supply chain industry to see opportunities to lever the data that exists on these platforms and really create value for themselves and for their customers. In the short term, however, we in this collaboration will be coming to market with 2 launch products. The names that we're using here are all very much in flux because marketing people get their hands on things and they make things sound a bit better. But currently we call them the Shipping Information Pipeline and Paperless Trade. Now, the Shipping Information Pipeline, you can think of it as an advanced track and trace solution where all the information about a shipment gets put in one place. And the reason why Amazon or DHL or whatever can put, when I bought something off Amazon, some books the other day, and they were able to tell me, not only is this, 90% of the way there, every warehouse, every truck, every plane that this package of books was put in to get to me. And the reason why they can do that is they control the entire supply chain. But we know in the container shipping industry that very rarely happens. And so what we can do is we can get the information from ports and from truckers and from the BCOs themselves, from government authorities, and pull that information in one place so that in one place, the right parties can get access to the right information in real time. The second application, which is currently called Paperless Trade, is utilizing blockchain technology to facilitate customs clearance tools. So I'll tell you a bit of a story. If you talk to any customs authority in the world, what they will tell you is they want all of the data in the world flowing through their systems so that they have essentially a panopticon of what's happening in global supply chain and trade, so that they can do accurate targeting and make sure they're getting the right quotas and levies and everything fulfilled. They also will say that they don't want any of their data being shared with any of the other customs authorities or any other organization around the world. And so you have this mutually exclusive outcome, which leads to a series of data islands or silos being built around the world where there is a lot of information there, but it's not shared and it's not made available to other parties. That said, these authorities do want to be able to share, work together and collaborate to increase efficiencies in global trade. They have a few options. They could do a bunch of point-to-point integrations around the world, which is really expensive, time-consuming, and risky that it'll fail. There is an opportunity to integrate to a single intermediary that essentially controls the flow of data in the global supply chain, but that's something that's not politically palatable to many organizations. The final example is to use a tool like blockchain, which distributes ownership of truth amongst all of those parties in that supply chain. So I'm from New Zealand. I'm currently living in America. If I were shipping something, probably dairy, from New Zealand to America, nobody wants just New Zealand or just America to have ownership of that data. Using the blockchain technology as we've applied it here, both New Zealand and America and the other parties to trade would have an equal ownership and the truth of that information. So if something were to happen, for example, because you can definitely trust New Zealanders, so let's just say in this instance, somebody would update the record on the New Zealand side of the ledger, that wouldn't matter because the rest of the network would reject that fraudulent activity, and the fact that everybody else disagrees with it would increase the overall trust in the platform. And that's what we're doing with paperless trade. We're essentially building a set of digital pipes to connect the global supply chain industry, and those pipes are powered by blockchain. So no one party has control over that flow of data. So the color scheme doesn't quite work. Well, that's fine. But this is essentially a visualization of the way that the platform works. So we have the different parties who sit on top there. So they are the gray on white boxes that you can see, and the green ones as well as the ship in the middle. They provide their information and documents to the big square or the rectangle that we've got going there called the Global Trade Digitization Platform. And the points of events or shipment information, as well as the documents, are a non-representative capture or snapshot of the information that we are going to be putting on the platform. And the applications are the blue boxes that sit above those. So the two that we've talked about, there'll be some in the future that we build, and then we want the supply chain ecosystem to build a lot as well. And the analogy that I use is this. So Apple Music exists, and some people use it, but I use Spotify on my iPhone, even though it's not an Apple product. And the reason is I think their user interface, whatever, is better. It's better for my needs. So even if the Global Trade Digitization project builds some of these applications, but the rest of the ecosystem can lever the underlying tools and capabilities and data better than we can, we think that's great. What does this all mean? What do we want to really achieve here? Fundamentally, we want to achieve something which is a utility for the industry. We can only do that if we actually create a lot of value for the entire supply chain industry. I'm going to take you through a couple of examples that we've got on this screen here. So if we look at freight forwarders, for example, we know that a lot of the work that freight forwarders do today relates to visibility services. And we also know that in a lot of instances, those visibility services are run essentially as a loss leader because they're seen as the price of doing business. But actually, getting visibility information today in a non-automated, non-integrated way is incredibly costly. You have dozens of staff managing a handful of your key accounts, and that doesn't scale. And so what we want to do is give the freight forwarders access to all the data they should have anyway, and unlock the staff who are currently spending their days, like me, on the phone, trying to follow up with everybody, and instead being reactive, be proactive and identify new ways of creating value for the company and having the time to go out there and find that. An example of that will be a lot of where freight forwarders make their money these days is in the management of their physical infrastructure, warehousing, trucking, access to trains, etc. This sort of a platform can give the operations team the visibility on the parts of the physical supply chain they don't have, so that they can better plan the deployment of their assets, their physical infrastructure, for the improvement and the increased efficiency for that part of their business. Another example is government authorities. So I'd like to use this example because this is about Australia. And in Canberra, there is a building which is 5 stories high. Every person in that building is employed doing data entry to essentially fill the targeting systems of the Australian customs system with data so that they can do good targeting. And that's something that just doesn't scale very well at all. And if you want to get more information in there or add nuance, It's very difficult to do that. Our platform looks to capture those information and those data ahead of time and provide those data to, or those additional data points to that authority, for example, that authority or any other authority around the world. So it'll allow for greater efficiencies in government actions, and it will mean those importers and exporters who act well and essentially are trustworthy, it will give them a differentiation when it comes to doing customs clearance, because they will be able to prove of themselves as a trusted actor rather than a party that is lumped in with everybody else. So it's kind of a win-win both for industry and for governments there. In the interest of time, because I'm pretty much towards the end of it, the final thing that I want to hit on at this point is we think we can create value for all parts of the supply chain industry, but this is something that's going to be collaborative, and I really look forward to the opportunity with the project team that we've got here to work on that collaboration and to build out this idea of an industry solution. So with that, Talia, I might hand it back over to you for the final section of this presentation. But thank you very much to everybody.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for a great presentation. So now we're going to move on to a few questions that were submitted during the program. Remaining questions, though, we will personally answer you in the next few days because we only do have a few minutes left till the end of the webinar. Okay, so we received a question from Jonas in Denmark, and it's directed to Daniel. And he would like to know, how are you testing the solution to ensure it is relevant to the industry?
Great question. So we are working with a number of industry participants, including all of the ones that were flagged on the previous slide, to do a series of proofs of concept to make sure that the platform is something that'll work for all parties. So what we're doing is literally taking data from the different systems that we have integrated to the platform, which include carriers, ports, governments, freight forwarders, etc., and showing what it would mean to have access to that information through our platform. We've seen shipments, for example, which have gone between two developed countries where the shipment should have taken 5 weeks, but because of existing issues with the current supply chain setup, that process actually ended up taking 9 weeks. Little things tend to cascade in supply chain industries. So, for example, if you turn up to the port with the wrong export declaration, it can take a couple of days to get that declaration updated, and then your container can be allowed onto the port. And in that time, you might have missed the ship, and you might need to get onto the next one. And all of these cascade all the way through the supply chain industry. So what we're doing is currently in a shadow process, but becoming more essentially tangible and real, is working with a series of BCOs and freight forwarders around the world to really get into the weeds of that to try and identify how we can create value.
Great, thank you for that, Daniel. Okay, one last question that we have time for. This one is for Jakub. It came in from Valerie in Austria. She was wondering, why would blockchain deliver more for supply chains than standard or community platforms?
Yeah, that's also an interesting one, Talia. So blockchain, I think the standard platforms or community platforms do bring value, or did bring value in what I call the first era of the internet, when we share the information. I think the key difference here is that, yes, blockchain will also provide the sharing of the information between each of the parties, but on top of it, it will basically bring the assurance of the original record, right? The provenance problem, as we talked about before, but also it will, and I think this is one of the future use cases, and we may not be yet there ready, but it will allow us to build totally new business models, like, for example, the direct in blockchain trading, so exchanges of assets versus goods in the blockchain, right? So we would not need that lengthy process to verify, say, financial statements, or verify that a buyer has certain, financial means as it would be working today. So all of these is basically enable to grow and to develop new business models. And again, you can take it same thing like what we had in the past with the internet, right? Back in the year 2000. We look at the internet primarily as as a mean of communication. We did use email, we did use websites, but we didn't know about this Uber or Airbnb type of models, right? And that came on a little bit later on, around the year 2010 or even later, and that brought us into totally new business models, right? So I think this is where the hidden treasure lays in the blockchain.
Thank you for that, Jakub. And thank you everyone for participating. We received quite a few questions, and as mentioned, we will get back to you with those that were unanswered. So this concludes today's webinar. A quick reminder also that you will receive a follow-up email that contains the recording of the broadcast within the next 5 business days. Also, if you have additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at solutions@amberroad.com. We appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Have a great afternoon.